I'm going to switch things up a little bit this morning and read the gospel first because it's the Exodus story I want to leave in your minds as we start. The gospel is from Matthew. Once more Jesus spoke to them in parables, saying, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding banquet for his son. He sent his slaves to call those who had been invited to the wedding banquet, but they would not come. Again, he sent other slaves, saying, 'Tell those who have been invited, look, I have prepared my dinner. My oxen and my fat calves have been slaughtered, and everything is ready. Come to the wedding banquet.' But they made light of it and went away, one to his farm, another to his business, while the rest seized his slaves, mistreated them, and killed them. The king was enraged. He sent his troops, destroyed those murderers, and burned their city. Then he said to his slaves, 'The wedding is ready, but those invited were not worthy. Go therefore into the main streets and invite everyone you find to the wedding banquet.' Those slaves went out into the streets and gathered all whom they had found, both good and bad, so the wedding hall was filled with guests. But when the king came in to see the guests, he noticed a man there who was not wearing a wedding robe, and he said to him, 'Friend, how did you get in here without a wedding robe?' And he was speechless. And then the king said to the attendants, 'Bind him hand and foot, and throw him into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. For many are called, but few are chosen.'" And this from the Hebrew Scriptures. When the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain, the people gathered around Aaron and said to him, "Come, make gods for us, who shall go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him." Aaron said to them, "Take off the gold rings that are on the ears of your wives, your sons, and your daughters, and bring them to me." So all the people took off the gold rings from their ears and brought them to Aaron. He took the gold from them, formed it in a mold, and cast an image of a calf. And they said, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt." When Aaron saw this, he built an altar before it. And Aaron made proclamation and said, "Tomorrow shall be a festival to the Lord." They rose early the next day and offered burnt offerings and brought sacrifices of well-being. And the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to revel. The Lord said to Moses, "Go down at once. Your people, whom you brought up out of the land of Egypt, have acted perversely. They have been quick to turn aside from the way that I commanded them. They have cast for themselves an image of a calf and have worshipped it and sacrificed to it and said, 'These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt.' The Lord said to Moses, 'I have seen this people, how stiff-necked they are. Now let me alone, so my wrath may burn hot against them, and I may consume them. And of you I will make a great nation.' But Moses implored the Lord his God and said, 'O Lord, why does your wrath burn hot against your people, whom you brought up out of the land of Egypt with great power and a mighty hand? Why should the Egyptians say, it was with evil intent that he brought them out, to kill them in the mountains and to consume them from the face of the earth? Turn from your fierce wrath, change your mind, and do not bring disaster on your people. Remember Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, your servants, how you swore to them by your own self, saying to them, 'I will multiply your descendants like the stars of heaven, and all this land that I have promised I will give to your descendants, and they shall inherit it forever.' And the Lord changed his mind about that disaster that he planned to bring on his people." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Sometimes the lectionary gods smile on us, and sometimes they don't. Today is one of those days that could go either way. On the one hand, we have the Hebrew Scriptures, we have the wrath of God. And on the other hand, in the Gospel, we have the wrath of God. A little more subtly, but still the wrath of God. And in the Psalm of the day, we remember the wrath of God. You can probably guess what I'm going with this morning. Then temptation, of course, would be to go with the epistle lesson from Philippians, which contains this well-known benediction. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. You might want to tuck that in the back of your minds. We might need that by the time we're through. But how often do we get to wrestle with those texts about God's anger? Or perhaps a better question would be, how often do we choose to wrestle with the wrath of God? It's not a popular topic. In all honesty, we like our God to be loving and kind. Like in our call to worship, we prefer a God who is merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness. A closer look at the text might remind us that one doesn't necessarily discount the other. The account of the Exodus is one of the more familiar and perhaps best loved stories in the Bible. But because it goes on for so long, we probably need a little refresher course to get where we pick up the story this morning. When today's chapter opens, the Israelites have been sitting at the bottom of the mountain, waiting for Moses to come down from his latest one-on-one chat with the Almighty. It has been a while, and it has occurred to them that he might not be coming back. And there is the pervasive belief that if Moses is not with them, then God is not with them. Moses, after all, is the one whom God chose to get them out of Egypt, then to get them through the wilderness to the Promised Land, which, by the way, is taking a lot longer than they anticipated. And now he simply disappeared in a cloud. So they turned to Aaron, the younger brother left in charge when Moses went to the mountain, and they ask him to make them a god who will go ahead of them and lead them out of this mess. And then they add, as for this Moses, we do not know what has become of him. This Moses, as if he's somebody they never laid eyes on. Never mind the whole plague thing and the Red Sea event and the manna from heaven and the water from a rock. Moses isn't around, and therefore God must not be around either. So what has this Moses been doing for the last 40 days and nights? Well, to be fair, he hasn't exactly been spinning his wheels. After sitting outside the cloud for a week, God finally let him in, and since then he has been sitting there listening to God give detailed instructions for the building of the tabernacle. They shall make an ark of acacia wood, 2.5 cubits long, 1.5 cubits wide, and 1.5 cubits high. They shall make a mercy seat of pure gold, a table of acacia wood overlaid with pure gold, a tabernacle with 10 curtains of fine twisted linen and blue and purple and crimson yarns. It goes on and on and on from the actual building of the tabernacle to the investiture of the priests and what they will wear, to the sacrifices and offerings that are expected. And at the end, God gives Moses the 2 stone tablets with what we call the 10 Commandments on them. Now you might imagine that Moses is pretty worn out after all of this. So when it comes to God's attention that the encampment of the Israelites has erupted in what is probably an orgy after that golden calf appeared, and God says, your people whom you brought out of the land of Egypt have acted perversely, and now I'm done with them. Leave me alone so that my wrath may burn hot against them and consume them. You might imagine Moses' reaction to be somewhat different than what's reported. I know I might have said, or at least thought, great, now they're my people. After 40 years in the desert with this collection of crabby pants, you're going to destroy them before we ever get to the land of milk and honey? But Moses has learned a few things about talking to God in those 40 years. So he says instead, wait a minute. You really don't want to do that. First of all, they're your people. You brought them out of slavery. Think what the Egyptians will say if you go through with this plan. But more than that, you made a promise. You made a promise to Abraham and Isaac and Israel, and you can't go back on that. And amazingly, God changes God's mind and backs down from the threat of total annihilation. Now, if you thought the wrath of God was scary, you haven't experienced the wrath of Moses. The next part of this story isn't often in the lectionary, and it's not the one for next week, so I'm not spoiling Tom's fun. So here's the short version. As Moses and Joshua come down the mountain, Joshua says, "Oh, wow, it sounds like a war down there." And Moses says, "Oh no, that's a party." And when they get back into camp, and Moses sees the golden calf and the whoop-de-doo going on, he smashes the stone tablets on the ground. Then he takes the golden calf, burns it with fire, grinds it to powder, scatters it on the water, and makes the Israelites drink it. Then here's my favorite part. He confronts Aaron, who claims that the golden calf just appeared. Seriously, he tells Moses that he took the gold, he threw it in the fire, and out came the calf. Chapter 32, verse 24. It's kind of like the teenager who says, "I drove the car in the garage, and all of a sudden there was a hole in the wall." And you want to say, "You're going to go with that? That's your story?" We don't find out what Moses says, but the next part is that Moses stands at the gate of the camp and says, "Who is on God's side?" The sons of Levi gather around, and Moses tells them to pick up their swords and go through camp, back and forth, from gate to gate, and kill their brothers, their friends, and their neighbors. And at the end of all that, there are 3,000 fewer Israelites. And all because of that little golden calf that apparently just came out of the fire all on its own. We, of course, would never do anything so terribly and so clearly wrong. We memorized the first commandment probably somewhere around the 5th grade. "You shall have no other gods before me." And we might even remember the rest of it. "You shall not make for yourself an idol, whether in the form of anything that is in heaven above, or in the form of anything that is on the earth beneath, or is it in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or worship them." We do not make golden calves. We know better. But somehow they just kind of fall out of the fire into our lives. There are any number of contemporary false gods, including, just on the short list, money, prestige, success, power. We make idols of celebrity and those who have celebrity status, movie stars, sports figures, Wall Street moguls, politicians, and people just like us who somehow manage to make it onto a reality television show. At one level, it's probably innocent enough. I mean, I read People magazine, but I'm not counting on Jennifer Lopez for my salvation. But what about that 12-year-old who sees his favorite basketball player sign a $9 million contract and says to himself, "That's my ticket out of here. That's my ticket out of poverty and abuse and going to bed hungry. Money and fame, it's as simple as that." And too often his ticket out is a stolen car or possession or domestic abuse that ends in incarceration, or worse, a stray bullet or a not-so-stray bullet. When that immortal, invisible, God-only-wise seems to be absent, it's all too easy to put our faith in things that we can see and touch and think we can count on. We are just as impatient as those Israelites waiting at the bottom of the mountain for Moses to get back to work. One commentator noted that whether it occurs on the way to the Promised Land, centuries later in the Northern Kingdom, or today in our own faith journey, there is still a very real and persistent human tendency to shape gods that we can manage and manipulate, and from which we can receive a strange comfort. Perhaps these false gods, these idols, represent something we long for or long to be. Perhaps they provide spiritual junk food to feed our deepest hungers. Like the ancient Hebrews, we may think we are fashioning a better representation of the God we worship, perhaps even fashioning this God, ironically, in our own image and likeness. Or maybe we're longing for something or someone so much better than what we see around us, especially in a world full of human brokenness and sin. The story from Exodus reminds us that not all objects of our spiritual longing are equal. What provides that strange comfort for you? It's a question worth asking on a personal level. And wouldn't it be nice if we ask ourselves the same question as a country from time to time? Catherine Huey, who writes a weekly lectionary commentary for the United Church of Christ, insightfully notes, that like the ancient Hebrews, we may succumb, for example, to a foolish faith in military power and its symbols, some of which can be manipulated, and some seemingly having developed a fearsome life of their own. She goes on to remind us that the bull calf fashioned by Aaron suggested not only fertility but also military might, and asks us to consider then what makes us feel secure today. What do we place our trust in? Closer to home, it's a question we need to be asking ourselves as a church, because even those things that we associate with God can become idols or false gods. Rolf Jacobson is an Old Testament professor at Luther Seminary, and he writes this: "Our idols are often false things that we worship in place of God, such as money, power, fame, career, self, the Minnesota Vikings, my new Norwegian sweater, my old guitar. You're welcome to fill in your top 10. But idols can also be things that we associate so much with God that we worship them instead of God. The church building, the old liturgy, the retired pastor, the painting above the altar, a doctrine to which we cling too tightly. This form of idol can actually be more dangerous to faith than outright idols. No finite image can fully capture the infinite God." I've been here as the interim pastor for exactly a month. And around about this time, I know, and you may think I'm not aware of it, there begins a little rumbling of suspicion that I'm here to change who this church is at its very foundation. It probably doesn't get said out loud, at least not for a few more months. And it's rumbled through every church I've served. And let me assure you that nothing could be further from the truth. First of all, that's not my job. That's God's job. It's called transformation. But it is my job to help us examine those things and those places and those long-held notions and attitudes, those myths that seem to govern our life together, to look at all that keeps us from allowing God to do God's work. So yes, you can expect me to nudge you a little, maybe even push you as individuals or committees or small groups. Wherever you are in this community, I'm going to encourage you and often try to help you take a look at the stuck places, the parts of this body that might be struggling or ailing and in need of healing or resuscitation or even resurrection. And to look very closely and thoughtfully and prayerfully at those things that aren't working so well, that may in fact be stumbling blocks to the Spirit's access, like the golden calves we may be reluctant to let go of, for fear that letting go will somehow change us in ways that we don't want to be changed. Old Testament scholar Walter Brueggemann, writing in the New Interpreter's Bible, reminds us that while Israel falls to the temptation to worship a fixed, finite object in God's place, we too are prey to the same temptation when we make God too manageable, too comfortable, even too fixed. Brueggemann suggests that God is in dialogue with us and is therefore a God of movement and change and risk as well. He writes that the church, summoned, formed, and empowered by the God of all dialogue, has in our anxiety-driven society an opportunity to be deeply dialogical about the most important issues. And this is directly connected to the kind of God we worship. If we believe, as we say we do, that God is still speaking, then we would do well to also believe that God is still listening and longing to be in conversation with us about the most important issues in this church. Brueggemann writes, "The text asserts that God is willing and yearning to be present, but that presence requires a community of generous faith, which gives its best skills, disciplines, and goods for the housing of the holy." As we look to the future, may we be that kind of community. Amen.